Okay, good evening and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we have a terrific program for you this evening featuring foreign policy expert and former ambassador Martin Indyk, here to talk with New York Times columnist and author Tom Friedman about Martin's illuminating new book, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. Couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Master of the Game. Martin brings quite a lot of personal expertise and experience to writing about Kissinger in the Middle East. First, he knows the region very well. And second, he's quite practiced at difficult diplomacy himself. In fact, much of Martin's work over several decades in and out of both government and the think tank community has centered around the Arab-Israeli process, US-Israeli relations, and threats posed by Iraq and Iran. Not long after coming to Washington in the 1980s, Martin became founding director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Since then, he's held senior positions at the Brookings Institution, including executive vice president, as well as founding director of the Center for Middle East Policy. And he's currently a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His government service has included 2 stints as US ambassador to Israel, as well as time under President Clinton on the National Security Council staff and at the State Department, and under President Obama as special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2013 and 14. Martin's 2 previous books include Innocent Abroad, an insider's account of US diplomacy in the Middle East under Clinton, and Bending History, which Martin co-wrote about Obama's foreign policy. The Master of the Game, drawing on now available US and Israeli archives and on interviews with Kissinger, Martin explores Kissinger's Herculean efforts as Secretary of State under both Presidents Nixon and Ford to stabilize the Middle East and effectively construct a new political order there following the 1973 war. The book captures not only the enormous challenges Kissinger faced in getting Israel, Egypt, and Syria to disengage militarily and establish stable borders, but also the formidable skills Kissinger brought to the task: his energy, determination, charm, intelligence, and vision. As Martin argues, Kissinger's fundamental aim wasn't peace per se, but order. And while much was achieved, peace in the Middle East, of course, has remained frustratingly elusive, and Martin's authoritative and incisive look back at Kissinger's strategy and methods helps us understand why. A conversation with Martin, as I mentioned a moment ago, will be Tom Friedman, whose own interest in the Middle East dates back to his school years. His reporting from the region in the 1980s garnered him 2 Pulitzers for international coverage and led to his first book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. Took over the foreign affairs column at the New York Times in 1995, and another Pulitzer and 6 more best-selling books later, he's still at it. And he's coming to us live tonight from Planet Word, which is this terrific literary museum that he and his wife Anne have helped establish in Washington. So Martin and Tom, the screen is yours.
Well, Brad, thank you very much. It's a treat to be back with Politics and Prose and with my friend Martin. My very first book event for Beirut to Jerusalem was with Politics and Prose. So I have a lot of fond memories. I share a lot of fond memories with Martin too, because we've been friends for over 40 years. I used to call him from Beirut when to talk to this Australian academic who we had a mutual friend, and we've been in conversation ever since. This book, Master the Game, is a masterpiece. And don't walk, run to Politics and Prose and get a copy. And I say it because I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I have read a lot and written a lot about the Middle East, but I really, really enjoyed this book, Martin.
Thank you.
And maybe to kick it off, talk about why you wanted to write a book about Henry Kissinger. and his diplomacy after you had been such an active participant in the very same endeavor of Middle East peacemaking. On the surface, it may seem like an odd choice. Why go mine the origins of the peace process after you had been so intimately involved with it decades after Henry Kissinger?
Well, thank you, Tom. I think that it's hard to understand why the world needs another book on Henry Kissinger. but my shelves are groaning with his volumes and others who have written about it. But nobody has really taken the time and effort to write about his Middle East diplomacy. And it's kind of strange because in the 4 years that he was Secretary of State, as opposed to the time when he was Nixon's national security advisor and did the opening to China and détente with the Soviet Union and all of those things in Vietnam and Bangladesh, Laos, Cambodia, Chile, and so on. That was all in the first 4 years. In his last 4 years, he focused almost entirely on the Middle East as Secretary of State and engaged in what President Biden would call relentless diplomacy to lay the foundations for the American-led peace process that, as you say, I had a role in both under President Clinton and President Obama. But our efforts under President Clinton, although initially successful with the Oslo Accords and the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, ended in disaster with the failure at Camp David and then the blow-up of the Intifada. And then in the Obama administration, when I oversaw the negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians, the parties ended up further apart at the end of the negotiations than they were at the beginning. You can blame that on me, but I think it also said something about the nature of the relationship between the two sides had become so toxic, but also said something, in my view, about the way in which we, the United States, had lost the ability to make peace, to move the parties to places where they would rather not go. And so I thought, instead of writing about that, I'd write about where it all began and try to understand why Kissinger was successful when we were not. And from that, to learn how to and how not to make peace going forward.
Well, I want to plumb both sides of that. It's one of the most vivid scenes I took away from the book is you describing a meeting with Abu Mazen, the Palestinian leader, in which you're basically prepping him for the fact that Barack Obama wants to put out a peace proposal that would basically have Palestinian sovereignty over Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem, where they could have a capital. And he falls asleep in the middle of the meeting. And basically never responds to President Obama's overture. Now, I would say in the hands of a more tendentious and inept analyst and author, someone might have said, well, it just shows you the Palestinians aren't serious and never were. But actually, you had a more interesting take. It was about that toxic place that Israeli and Palestinian relations had gone to. I just want you to pick up on that, because I think it's so very important that how is it that the peace process just ran out of steam, and in what way did both sides contribute to that?
Well, I think that by that point, and we're talking now about 2014.
Yeah, just bring people up to date. What was the context there, Mark?
Right. By that point, we had the Intifada at the end of 2000, and that raged for 5 years. Thousands of Israelis and Palestinians killed and injured as a result of the violence involved in that conflict. And that destroyed all of the trust between the leaders and between the people. And then on top of that came terrorism, incitement, settlement building that just continued and convinced both sides that the other side wasn't interested in making peace, wasn't interested in the two-state bargain. And as much as they might want it, both sides no longer believed that the other side did. And so that was the environment that we came into with John Kerry, God bless him, with all of his effort and so on. He managed to get the two sides back to the table to negotiate final status agreements, but they were so far apart in terms of their distrust, which meant that their demands of the other were so far from a compromise that it basically was impossible to bridge the gap. Now, we came up with ideas that could have, in theory, bridged the gap, but that was the other side of it. We, the United States, no longer had the ability to get the two sides to accept it. That story that you told about Abu Mazen was really a story for me about him reaching the point where he no longer believed that the United States, he certainly didn't believe that Netanyahu was serious, and he did not believe that we could deliver Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And this is why I say go back to Kissinger, because one of the basic precepts of Kissinger's approach was the United States, to be credible in the peace process, has to be able to show that it can influence Israel. That's why the Arabs came to Washington. You remember how Sadat used to say that the United States gives Israel everything from a loaf of bread to a phantom jet. He was exaggerating about the loaf of bread,
Right.
but not about the phantom jet. And that's why I'm going to Washington. Kissinger understood that, and understood that therefore Washington had to show that the United States could deliver. And we have lost that ability, at least with the Netanyahu government. And so the combination left us in a situation where I think Abu Mazen, he just shut down. He didn't even respond to Obama. And yes, sure, he missed another opportunity, no question. You can see what Trump offered him was 10% of what Obama was prepared to offer him on Jerusalem, the issue that he's supposed to care most about. But, you know, at this point, things have gotten so bad that it's not possible to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, despite the fact that four presidents tried, each in their own way, from Clinton to Trump.
So therefore, Martin, what do we need to understand about Kissinger's strategy and approach to peacemaking that would be relevant today?
Right. So I think that the critical element in Kissinger's approach was informed by his skepticism about the willingness of the Arabs to accept Israel and make peace with it, and his skepticism about Israel's ability to meet Arab requirements when it came to withdraw from territory that Israel occupied in 1967. And therefore, that bargain of territory for peace was one that he didn't really believe in. What he believed in was that eventually, over time, perhaps over decades, he never really specified, but over a long period of time, the Arabs would exhaust themselves and come to terms with Israel. And Israel, in the meantime, would be able to build its strength with American support to the point where it would, when the Arabs were finally ready, be in a position to make the ultimate withdrawals. But the only way that he could legitimize that process was to have Israel withdraw in small territorial steps. That would lubricate the process, but it would not overload the process. And he was very conscious of the danger of overreaching, something that, you know, we who came after him knew not Kissinger in that regard. And it was partly because, we can go into it, but for other reasons, he tended to obfuscate what he was really on about, what he was really pursuing. And so I think that by the time we came around to it in the Clinton administration. You know, I sat down with President Clinton, the first meeting we had as his Middle East advisor, and said, you know, Mr. President, if you put your mind to it, you can get 4 agreements, Arab-Israeli agreements, in your first term, and we can be done with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he said, oh, I want to do that. And when I look back at that, I think, what was I thinking? But you remember those days,
Oh,
Tom. It was like
I was there.
so as a result of Baker's effort, you were there, Madrid.
Yeah.
All the Arabs were sitting at the table with Israel, and the Palestinians included. The Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War was over. There was no address other than the peace table. And we really thought that we could end the conflict. Kissinger would have never said such a thing, never believed such a thing, because he had an inherent skepticism from his own experience fleeing the Nazis and seeing how appeasement led to the Second World War. He thought the pursuit of an end of conflict arrangement was something that states were never really capable of, except over a very long period of time. So that was the essential difference. We all, and I will say all, you know, all those who came after Kissinger went for the final deal, the Holy Grail, end the conflict, get the Nobel Peace Prize. When a more cautious, gradual, incremental approach would have, I think, gotten us a lot further.
If Joe Biden had nominated Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State, not Tony Blinken, or even just asked to enlist him at nearly 100 right now to be his special Middle East envoy for peace, which Henry probably wouldn't resist, actually.
That's right.
Knowing him, what approach do you think he would take if he were to come in now to try to clean this up?
Well, I can only go on what
Sure.
the book demonstrates of his approach.
Yeah.
But it fits the times because, as I've been explaining, we can't get there from here. We can't get to an end of conflict negotiation. The last time was the negotiations that I was responsible for. That was 7 years ago. There hasn't been any negotiation between the Israelis and Palestinians since, and there's good reason for that. So, you know, with an Israeli government of left and right-wing parties that can't agree amongst themselves of what the outcome should be, half of them want oppose the Palestinian state, half of them support it. And a Palestinian polity that's deeply divided between Hamas that wants to destroy Israel, the Palestinian Authority that wants to make peace with Israel. And so, you know, we simply don't have the means of getting there from here. And it's no coincidence that there's really no effort to try to put together a final status negotiation like we had under Kerry and Obama. So we have to adopt a Kissingerian incremental approach, which is what I'm sure he would do.
Yes.
Now, the Israeli government has said they're ready to take steps. Kissinger called this diplomacy step-by-step diplomacy.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're kind of open to moving in that direction. But what Kissinger made clear, and I would say it was the art of his diplomacy, was that Israel had to make territorial withdrawals, small, digestible withdrawals, but territory had to be in the mix to legitimize the process, because at heart, that's what the conflict was about.
Yes.
And so therefore, I think a Kissingerian approach would be incremental. In a way, it would be to go back to the Oslo process. God forbid, you know, that because Oslo has become such a dirty word. But if you think about what Oslo was, it was purely Kissingerian. And Rabin learned from Kissinger. It was a 3-step process of withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza by the Israeli army with no end game. There's nothing in the Oslo Accords about a Palestinian state, about Jerusalem, about refugees. There's no timetable. Instead, there is a gradual incremental process. And it seems to me that's what we need to get back to. there's a third further withdrawal required in the Oslo Accords, and the Oslo Accords are the only accords that the Israelis and Palestinians have signed and still nominally adhere to in terms of the running of the West Bank, at least. So I think that the skeletal basis is there for a Kissingerian step-by-step approach. But the Biden administration would have to lean into it more than they are at the moment. Not a heavy lift, because that's not called for, but more engagement in trying to push the parties towards a territorial move that can re-engender some hope and legitimacy to a process that lacks them both.
You know, you talk about this in the book, Martin, but please share with our listeners, what did Henry Kissinger get wrong? What were the mistakes he made that we should also avoid today or contemplate as we go forward?
Yeah. So he was, as I said, cautious and skeptical, and therefore opposed to overreaching. And that's what he got right, I think. What he got wrong was that on two very important occasions, he underreached. He aimed too low. And as a result, he missed opportunities. The first opportunity was to head off the 1973 Yom Kippur War. You'll remember from those days how Sadat was threatening to go to war, and nobody took him seriously, especially not Kissinger. Kissinger referred to him as some character out of the Verdi's opera Aida, which was set in ancient Egypt.
That's right.
He thought he was a buffoon. And as a result, when Sadat sent his national security advisor, Hafez Ismail, to Washington in February of 1973, with a far-reaching peace initiative, Kissinger at first was quite excited about it. But as soon as he talked to Yitzhak Rabin, who was the ambassador of Israel in Washington at the time, and Rabin said, nah, there's nothing new here. And Golda came to town, Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, and said, forget about it. He dropped it. Had he taken it seriously then, because Sadat was looking for a way to get a peace process going without war, short of war. The only reason he went to war was because Kissinger and the Israelis wouldn't pay attention to his demands. So that was the first one. He missed the opportunity to head off the war, I believe. The second one was after the war, when he worked so assiduously to get agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria involving territorial withdrawals on Israel's part from parts of the Sinai, part of the Golan Heights. He could have then negotiated an agreement between Israel and Jordan, which would have put Jordan back in the West Bank, in Jericho, just like Rabin, 20 years later, put Arafat back in the West Bank in Jericho first. And the king was keen. The Israelis were ready to contemplate it, although it's not clear how far they would have gone. But Kissinger wouldn't touch it. And Kissinger kept on saying to the Israelis, watch out, if you don't engage with the Jordanians, the PLO is going to take over and you'll have to deal with them. And yet he said, I'm not going to get involved. He said it was quite explicit. I'm not going to press you. I'm not going to get involved. And that was because he liked the king, but he didn't value Jordan. Jordan was too small in the hierarchy of states. It had too little power. And the Palestinian problem, from his point of view, was an Israeli and Jordanian problem, not an American problem. His focus was on getting Egypt out of the conflict so as to make a state-to-state conflict practically impossible, and to legitimize Egypt's withdrawal by getting Syria involved in an agreement with Israel that would also calm things down in the Golan Heights, which it did. And so therefore he missed that opportunity too. And why was that important? Because it was the last chance to deal with the Palestinian problem in a Jordanian context. And after that, it became impossible. The PLO became the sole representative of the Palestinian people. And you know, there've been many efforts by the Israelis since to try to get Jordan involved that has never worked, because that was the critical hinge point in history. And Kissinger himself admits that he made a mistake at that point. But it was because he was so focused on promoting a stable order that he didn't take account of the way in which a failure to resolve the Palestinian problem would in the end disrupt the order.
This issue of order figures very prominently in Kissinger's thinking about the world and the Middle East. And in some ways, as I read your book, the critique was he was ready too often to live with order for order's sake, but not insist on order with a positive slope, with a bend toward justice, which is what actually makes it sustainable. Talk about that. Where did his obsession with order come from, and how did that play out?
Right. So, I mean, his obsession with order is understandable on a personal level. As a refugee from Nazi Germany, fleeing the chaos of the rise of Nazism and the murderous impact on his immediate family. 13 of his immediate relatives were murdered by the Nazis, or almost all of his schoolmates. And so, you know, order in his own life became very important. And it became kind of his North Star in terms of his understanding of the international system and how to impact it. And he's written a whole book on world order, but his first book was about how Metternich and Castlereagh, the Austrian and British foreign ministers after the Napoleonic Wars, established order in Europe that kept the peace more or less, meaning no major conflicts for 100 years. And that's what he tried to do when the war broke out in the Middle East, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Before that, he is, as you said, he's not focused on, interested in the issue of justice, the issue of addressing Arab grievances. And so they went to war. From that, he understood that the system that he was trying to establish there had to have some legitimizing process for the Arabs. They had to feel that their grievances were being addressed. Their grievance basically was about territory that Israel occupied in 1967. And so unless there was a peace process that provided some sense of fairness, some modicum of justice, excuse me for a minute, unless there was that kind of process, he felt that it wouldn't be stable. So he did introduce the peace process as a way of stabilizing the order.
You know, Martin, I'm listening to you and just thinking of all our conversations over the years about this. And I'm reminded actually of a conversation I had once with the editor of Haaretz. And I asked him why they ran my column in Hebrew. I got a big kick out of that. They ran my New York Times column in Hebrew. And he said, Tom, it's because you're the only optimist we have. And there was another Israeli at the dinner who said, Tom, I know why you're an optimist. It's because you're short. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, you can only see that part of the glass that's half full. And so actually, I'm not that short, but I've tried to be an optimist, but I find I'm struggling these days when I look at all the broken pieces, you know, kind of on the ground. And I know you're right about the only way to build this back better, to use the current lingo, would be incrementally. But do you think that's possible, Martin? When you look at this region of the world that you've lived in, that you've devoted so much of your diplomatic life to, your academic life, What do you think is going to happen there? Because I don't, the optimist in me is not optimistic anymore, at least unaided by hallucinogenic drugs.
Well, you're a giant to me, Tom. So if that means you can see the glass half empty, I think you've done a good job of portraying that. But I too am worried about the situation, because it actually reminds me of the situation before the 1973 war, when Kissinger thought the status quo was sustainable. Right. And everybody has come to think that, it's sustainable.
Yeah.
That Abu Mazen isn't going to disrupt the status quo. Israel obviously isn't. Nobody's trying to push to do anything. Hamas is creating problems, but they can be contained in Gaza. And so she'll be right, mate, as they say in my former country. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption. And it was precisely the assumption that Kissinger made, and that Sadat demonstrated to him that he was wrong by going to war. And, I can paint a scenario for you. Palestinian Authority is now, today, very close to collapse.
Yeah.
Abu Mazen is way beyond his use-by date as a leader of the Palestinians. He's lost almost all credibility. Hamas is there on the ground, sensing an opportunity to take over, which Israel will not let happen. But these are the ingredients, it seems to me, without any political horizon, any hope that of a political process that can lead to an explosion. And we won't know it. It's like, you take a pencil and you press on both ends of it and it'll snap, but you don't know the moment it'll snap until it happens. And then we'll all say, oh, yeah, well, of course we should have known. But I think it would be so much better if we invested in trying to move the process forward incrementally, not beyond the means of both sides to deal with, than to just sit back and let it blow, because I think it will blow. So that's the first one.
One thing I really worry about is that Israel is suppressing the signal in two ways. One, it's perfected its means of control in the West Bank. I mean, through AI, in cyber, they know that a Palestinian is going to reach into a drawer and pull out a knife before that guy even knows it, And the other way, frankly, they've suppressed the signal is here in Washington. I mean, basically, after 12 years of Bibi, if you are against Israel's approach to the peace process now, you just shut your mouth. It just isn't worth it anymore. You know what I mean? And so I think they've dangerously suppressed the signal of what you're talking about. And I would not wish this ever, but I do wonder if it doesn't need an explosion, the kind of pain that Henry Kissinger worked with, the kind of raw material he had, pain on all the parties, which is what allowed him to make the breakthrough that he made. Again, I'm not wishing it, but I do confess I wonder that sometimes,
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between kind of recommending it or wishing it, as you say, and analyzing what could happen and what that would create. But the war in 1973 was immensely destructive, highly traumatic for Israelis, as you know. But it created a plastic moment for Henry Kissinger. In which he was able to mold a peace process that redounded to Israel's immense advantage over the years. And so, I certainly don't wish it. That's why I'm saying I think we need to take actions to head it off. But if it comes, then yes, we need to be prepared to get in there and shape it in a way that can finally get us to a point where we can try to resolve it.
Martin, talk about two new kind of players in the equation now who really weren't there when Kissinger was there. One is Iran, and the other is the Abraham Accords. I have this memory of Henry Kissinger once called the Shah of Iran a nut, and then said he was quoted out of context. And I always wanted to understand what is the context in which you could call the Shah a nut and it would be okay, but never mind. We're not dealing with the Shah of Iran anymore. We're dealing with, so Iran is a big new player now, and the Abraham Accords are a big new player, so that the Henry Kissinger of the early 21st century now would have to bring them into the equation. Talk about that.
Right. So Kissinger would see Iran, does see Iran, as a revolutionary state, obviously. And he says that Iran has to decide whether it wants to be a cause or a country.
Yeah.
Whether it wants to be a revolution or a state. And if it wants to be a state, respecting the other states in its neighborhood and not seeking to undermine them or threaten them, then, from his point of view, it should be brought into the regional security framework, the regional order, indeed. And he argues, the United States, should then, when that should happen, we should then adopt a position of equidistance between the different powers in the region and be the balancer, be the flywheel. But that's clearly not appropriate today when Iran is still a revolutionary power. And therefore, he falls back to the balance of power, which is where he always begins his analysis. And there needs to be an equilibrium in the balance of power, and that requires the United States to bring together a grouping of status quo powers, Sunni Arabs and Israel, to be exact, who can counterbalance Iran. We, the United States, cannot do it on our own anymore because we got to balance China. That's where we need to pay attention to the balance of power. So we've got to have these regional powers, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular, and work with them to counter Iran, which is where the Abraham Accords come in, because they provide a means for these countries to work together. And what's fascinating about the impact of the Abraham Accords is everybody was looking at who's going to be the next country to normalize. When will Saudi Arabia normalize and so on? Turns out, and this is so typical of the Middle East that it's Egypt and Jordan that are the next, actually.
It's a very good way to put it. Yeah,
right, because Egypt and Jordan have been keeping Israel at arm's length, even though they've had peace with them for so many decades in Egypt's case, because there wasn't a resolution of the Palestinian problem. They basically preferred to keep Israel at arm's length. Now that the Emiratis and the Moroccans and the Bahrainis and even the Sudanese are moving to normalize with Israel, they don't want to miss out. And they've got a cover. So now they're engaging with Israel. And lo and behold, Egypt is moving into Gaza as we speak. A much bigger presence there, trying to stabilize the situation. They've moved bulldozers in to do reconstruction. They got, of course, big signs of President Sisi now in Gaza. They managed to mend fences with the Qataris, so they're providing the money for this, and they're working hand in glove with Israel to effect a long-term ceasefire with Hamas under Egyptian custodianship. And that's exactly the way, I think, in which the Abraham Accords is not only going to help to balance Iran, but also help to create a context in which it'll be easier to deal with the Palestinians. I hope it's a more of a stretch to see Jordan moving back into the West Bank. But as the Palestinian Authority crumbles, that is, I think, a possibility. Jordanians are going to be very careful about it for fear of the instability that it can create on the East Bank. But I do think that with Egypt and Jordan engaged, this will help to put in place kind of buttresses for a new process with the Palestinians.
Jordan, is interesting you say that about Jordan on the West Bank, Mark, because Jordan may feel that to protect itself, it'll have to project its power into the West Bank.
Yeah.
And there could be a real fear of fauda there, a real fear of chaos that could also even welcome that. So I think there is a plastic moment of mourning. Martin, we've got about 15 more minutes left. And Brad, I know you've got some questions from our viewing audience. And why don't you jump in with a couple of questions for Martin?
Sure. Well, there's someone named Mark in the audience who's asked quite a few questions. So we'll take just one or two from him. And let me, in the meantime, invite all those of you who haven't posted questions in the Q&A to please go ahead and do so. So Mark's most recent question, which was, who was Kissinger's mentor in the Middle East?
Anwar Sadat, pure and simple.
Interesting.
Henry Kissinger really didn't know much about the Middle East. He had never visited the Arab world before he became National Security Advisor. He'd visited Israel 6 times. He'd never written about the Middle East, never written about the Ottoman Empire. Given his interest in 19th century Europe, you would have thought that he would have been interested in that. He basically kept away from it. And then Nixon kept him away from it when he went into the White House, because Nixon considered him, because of his Jewishness, considered him, suspect. He told anybody who would listen, his staff, Arab foreign ministers, Soviet ambassador, that Kissinger was pushing Israel's agenda. So for the first 3 years, he was basically ordered by Nixon to stay out of it. Now, if you know something about Henry Kissinger, he could not abide by that. And so what ensued was a battle royal between him and the Secretary of State, Will Rogers, which Kissinger eventually won. And Nixon eventually gave up and said, all right, you take it over. But he didn't actually engage with the Arabs until after the 1973 war. And that's when he was first exposed to Sadat. And that's when he first realized that, far from a buffoon, he was dealing with a great leader, a visionary leader, who wasn't interested in the details, who was prepared to invest in Kissinger, wasn't interested in playing him off against the Soviet Union, basically wanted peace. Now, Kissinger wasn't prepared to go as fast as Sadat wanted to go, and therefore Sadat was kind of leading him. Was always one step ahead of him, as I detailed in the book. And it was a fascinating friendship. And Kissinger to this day will say, I could not have done what I did without Anwar Sadat.
Well, that pretty much addresses.
I'm sorry. Jump in with one question, Brad, that just occurred to me. What if Henry Kissinger were writing a review of your book for the New York Times? What would he say he liked, and what would he say he didn't like?
Well, he liked the fact that I devoted 688 pages to his diplomacy. As he said, he used to say when he was introduced in speeches, he said, they say I don't need an introduction, but I like one. And so that part he likes and he appreciates. But what he doesn't like is what I show in the book, his amazing manipulative capabilities. And I meant that as a compliment. That's why I call him the master of the game, because that's what diplomacy is about. It's about manipulating people, leaders, to get them to move to places they'd rather not go. And he really was amazing at that. And particularly, as I already said, Sadat was easy, but the Israelis were impossible. And he had knockdown, drag out fights with Golda Meir and then with Rabin. And he managed to convince them with his arguments and with his manipulations in a way that was truly fascinating. And I think is a real education for people who want to understand what diplomacy is about. And because I had the advantage of not only having been in the rooms and having dealt with some of these leaders myself, but in particular, the documents, every negotiation that he had with Arab and Israeli leaders is there in the archives. And so I could try to bring that to life in a way that gives people, I hope, a real sense of what it means to engage in diplomacy in the Middle East.
Well, it does, you do bring that to life. And your comment about his deviousness reminds me that I have a rule about the Middle East that any American general or diplomat assigned to the Middle East should have to take a test. Very short test, only one question. Do you think the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line? If you answer yes, you can go to Japan, Korea, Germany, and Okinawa. You cannot come to the Middle East. The only come to the Middle East is if you can scratch your left ear with your right hand. And Kissinger was very good at that.
Exactly.
Brad.
The next question from Ryan is, what would you say is Dr. Kissinger's greatest lesson for the rising generation of diplomats? And I'm thinking it has something to do with the contortion that Tom was just doing.
Yeah. So look, Kissinger had a very good point that I think we really need as diplomats and next generation diplomats need to take into account, which is the United States, with its overwhelming power, can be a force for good, but if it overreaches, it can be a force for bad. And there's a danger in overreach, particularly in the Middle East, and try to make the Middle East over in our own image, whether it's a peaceful domain or a democratic domain. It all came unstuck in a very bad way. So we need to proceed with a certain humility and a caution and skepticism that was Kissinger's hallmark. But at the same time, we need to find that kind of Goldilocks middle way, because to be unambitious, to be kind of just trying to maintain the status quo without promoting a sense of justice and legitimacy means that we won't be able to sustain a stable order and a movement of the region in the direction of peace, justice, and eventually democracy as well.
Martin, I was thinking as you were talking, if Tony Blinken, our current Secretary of State, were looking for a kind of Kissingerian opportunity in the region now, a big move that could actually really impact more things in more places, in more ways, on more days. I think the one I would advise him on, I'd love your feedback on this, mine would be to try to flip Syria from the Iranian camp to the Sunni Arab camp and work actually with Putin to do it. Putin would have an interest in that in a certain way. Lord knows Bashar Assad would have, and that would be a really big geopolitical move for a modern day Henry Kissinger. What do you think of that?
A stretch, Tom. Bit of a stretch.
Tell me why.
Well, look, I mean, you're not dealing with Hafez al-Assad, who Kissinger was dealing with, who could calculate the balance of power himself like a computer and could deliver. And Bashar al-Assad is a brutal thug and war criminal. And I mean, so he's not not the best one to deal with. Secondly, the Iranians are pretty much embedded in Syria, and it's easy to say let's flip Syria, but it would be very difficult to do. It's not at all clear that the Russians would go along with this because of the instability that it would create in Syria, which is they're not interested in that. But I do think that you could be less ambitious about it and work towards it, at least to start to counterbalance the Iranians with the Arabs. And the Arabs seem to be willing to do that. But all the time, bearing in mind that Assad has a lot to answer for, and we cannot simply ignore no, the one who needs to be flipped at the moment, in my opinion, is Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, who is in need of some Kissingerian lessons about how to maintain order and rather than disrupt it. Get out of Yemen, for example. Make it clear that he takes responsibility for the killing of Khashoggi, and that it won't happen again. And freeing the women that he's even tortured. I mean, who does that? We need Saudi Arabia to be in harness to an order that is in need of stabilization. We need Saudi Arabia working with us on energy issues and oil pricing issues and so on. And he's a real challenge. That's where I think we need to spend our energies.
You're right. He became in his own mini way, a kind of revolutionary power, not a status quo.
Disruptive power.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Good point. Brad, you got time for one more question, maybe?
Okay, well, while we're on the present day, let me combine two. Susan asks, where do you think Israel is headed now with its current government? And Lex wants to know, we've gone all this time and not a single word about settlements.
Mm. Well, thanks, Lex.
There was
Good
one
point.
word about that. Martin did mention settlement. Israel built settlements and the Palestinians.
No, but he's absolutely right. And
Great point.
I will take the opportunity to say a few words about settlements. Look, as I explained, Kissinger's approach required Israel to give up territory, ultimately all of the territory, more or less, which is the standard US position, that Israel should withdraw to the 67 lines with minor border rectifications in exchange for peace, secure borders, etc. When Kissinger left office, there were 1,900 settlers in the occupied territories. Today, there are 466,000 in 131 settlements. And ironically, this was not Kissinger's intention, but his approach led to this. He was, as I said earlier, in order to convince the Israelis to give up territory, he couldn't sell them on peace because he didn't believe in it. So he sold them on time, territory for time for Israel to reduce its isolation, to strengthen itself with American assistance, to exhaust the Arabs. The irony was he was too successful. The Israelis adopted that strategy as their foundational principle for their negotiating strategy and used time not only to give up territory, which they did in the Sinai, Golan, parts of the West Bank, 40% of the West Bank, all of Gaza, but also to consolidate their grip on the rest of the West Bank, the 60%, through that settlement process, which was supported, as you know, Tom, by both governments of the left and the right. Yeah. And now we're in a situation where the settlements make Kissinger's basic principle of territorial withdrawal all but impossible. And without that, it's not going to be possible to have a legitimate peace process that leads eventually to a two-state solution and an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So settlements have become a problem, and it's not one that's going to be easily fixed.
Well, Martin, this has been a real treat. Really, it's been so interesting just to roll this region around now and look at it from all these new perspectives, which the way you mined history really gave me a different way to look at it. So I want to thank you, Brad. I want to thank you for hosting this. And I want to repeat what I said: to run, don't walk, run to Politics and Prose. Support your local bookseller, okay? That's hugely important because they put on events just like this. And by Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. It really is, I think, it belongs in the library of great books about the Middle East today.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Tom. Thank you, Brad.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom. Great moderating. And Martin, it truly is a fascinating and such an instructive history. Let's hope the right people in the right places read it and heed its lessons. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Master of the Game. And Martin, although he's in New York, was in Washington just the other day and stopped by PNP. And so, yes, we have signed copies of Master of the Game. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Mhm.